Just in terms of setting the scene for our conversation, the Middle East is fraught with many challenges. If we went back 4 or 5 years to the early time of the Obama administration, the perception was that this region was in a fairly stable environment, that the best thing the United States could do was to wash its hands of the Middle East and pivot to Asia. And that actually became the mantra of the Obama administration. But the Middle East refused to be ignored, and actually, the more we try to ignore the Middle East, the more we encourage circumstances that makes it impossible for us to ignore the Middle East. So the Arab Spring, the events that promised change in the Arab world, change of government, perhaps democracy in some circumstances, maybe was interpreted by us as a good opportunity to install more stable political systems that it would actually facilitate America's ability to leave the region. Now, fast forward to today, the Arab Spring's legacy is actually a number of failed states in the region. So, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen are essentially in a free fall for the most part. And we have a number of other governments, regimes in the region, states that are in danger of a greater crisis. Lebanon, Jordan, for instance, come to mind. So, the legacy of the change is actually greater instability rather than stability. In the United States made a conscious decision to very quickly withdraw from Iraq, which actually put the deal that was put on the table by the United States in 2006, 2007, a power-sharing deal between Shiites and Sunnis and the Kurds, to largely become undone. I think actually it was a too rapid and a precipitous withdrawal from Iraq that caused the political deal that relied on U.S. presence and U.S. guarantee to fall apart. One of the issues when you go around the Middle East and you talk to the Arab regimes that really bothers them is that the way things have unfolded in Syria actually has begun to sort of shift things in the direction of Iran. So yesterday, Secretary of State Kerry said that we would have to negotiate with Assad about the future of Syria. If you went back 2 years, we said we will never, ever talk to Assad, and Assad has to be gone yesterday. So that shift already suggests that Iranian policy succeeded, in the sense that Iran insisted at the beginning that Assad is not going to leave. And by the fact that Assad is still standing, so we're facing two choices. Either we have to increase our engagement in Syria, or we basically have to find a way to end the fighting. And find a way to end the fighting, now the Iranians have made it impossible to do that without Assad. So at some point, I think the next level everybody's afraid in the region is that we increasingly we end up in the same place with Assad that we are with the Iraqi government in Iraq. So we can't openly endorse Assad, but we will basically have a don't ask, don't tell policy with Assad and Iran. So let Assad and the Iranians crush ISIS. We won't condone it, but we won't object to it as well. And you could see that actually tensions between U.S. and Turkey and U.S. and Saudi Arabia and U.S. and Qatar and U.S. and the Arab governments has increased because it's very clear that they're still committed to the fact that Assad has to leave, but they don't see the same commitment in us. Right. Now, that's not because Iran has wooed us, but that's because the logic, if you thought about it, the logic of we don't want to get involved in the Middle East, and yet there is a problem in the Middle East that needs to be taken care of. How do you sort of square that circle? I mean, you either have to go in yourself, which was the way we thought about these issues when we went into Afghanistan and we went to Iraq, or you basically say we don't want to go in, so then who's going to be fighting ISIS? And without declaring it publicly, the Iranians have stood up and raised their hand. And so in Iraq, they're actually doing it. In Syria, what they're telling everybody in the international community is we're going to back Assad, let Assad crush these, which actually was the Russian argument from day one, that you're not going to go in, we're not going to go in. The only force fighting ISIS is Assad. And the other argument that they make is that Assad may be horrendous, but it's ISIS that you're focused on. And so you have to find solutions for ISIS. So that actually really puts a big problem on the table for US foreign policy. So, in a de facto way, we're beginning to rely on Iran, although we don't want to claim it. So in Iraq we're letting them do the fighting, but we're letting them do the fighting because we don't want to do the fighting. So if you don't want to do the fighting, then in a de facto way, you allow the Iranians to do the fighting. Now, whether Iran has the capacity to do this remains to be seen, whether they can actually carry wars in Yemen, Iraq, and Syria at the same time. But right now, that's their power play. They're basically saying they're dealing with an America that doesn't want to get engaged in the Middle East, and they're basically playing to that reluctance, if you were to say. Well, if we wanted to have influence in the Arab world, you can't have influence by being absent. I mean, I hear this in the region. They say, well, if you've decided you're going to go to Asia and you're not going to be here, then basically we're going to factor you out. You can't have it both ways. You can't just show up and say, everybody rally together and follow my lead, and we want you to do X, Y, and Z, go bomb Iraq, go bomb Syria, and then we're going to leave. So you're not going to get, there's no longer trust in American policy in the region. I mean, we've communicated very loud and clear to them for 3-4 years that we really don't want to have anything to do with you, and our future lies in Asia, and we're gone. And I think that takes a lot of repairing to do. I remember one time in the Arab countries, a minister who was from a country who was very engaged in Syria and is very anti-Assad. He said the lesson of Syria to us is that Russia stands by its friends and the US doesn't. I mean, he was comparing Egypt and Syria. So, you abandoned Mubarak the minute the wind began blowing in a different direction. Well, look at these guys. They don't care about what international public opinion says about them, how much you want to shame Putin and the Iranian government. They're going to stick by their friends. And in this region, that really matters. So I do think that. I do think that, we are paying, and we will pay for the strategic decision we made. But, we're reluctant. We also don't want to leave completely either. And I think that's going to hurt the U.S. With Iranians, I think the difference between Iran's foreign policy today and, say, under the Shah's regime was the Shah basically didn't want to have anything to do with the Arab world. He didn't want influence there. He just didn't want any trouble from their coming to Iran. Whereas the Islamic Republic is really interested in the Arab world for varieties of reasons. So it actually craves influence in the Arab world. Some in Iran crave it, I would say, in an offensive, hegemonic way, and there are those in Iran who crave it in a defensive way, in the sense that ultimately attack on Iran will come from the Arabs. And forward defense in Iran means you control them. So Iraq invaded Iran, 1 million Iranians by many estimates died. They occupied a part of Iran. They wanted to annex it. And so the Iranians say that the only way that Iraq is not going to invade Iran again is if you control Baghdad. And now we've got Baghdad, we don't want to rule over them. We just, are going to Finlandize Iraq in that sense. So, and I think Iran's geostrategy is based on two things. Iran has probably, it has the lowest expenditure on military of most of its neighbors as a portion of its GNP, compared to Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and UAE as a percentage of its income. And then technologically, those countries have access to much more superior weaponry than Iran. So Iranians have decided that actually it's, what we call asymmetric forces, which means militias and guerrilla fighters are a more optimal military mechanism for them to use. For instance, they look at Hamas and Hezbollah as a forward defense against Israel. So keep Israel busy on its own borders, so it's not busy on your borders. So if Congress basically uses the Iran deal to arrogate many more authority and basically says that the president cannot enter into any agreement without congressional authority, then that actually can undermine many other negotiations and discussions that any U.S. president could have with any foreign leader. It will have a broader impact. I mean, and I think that's very key. The second is that it already has started to impact the Iranian negotiations. So if you're sitting in Iran, you begin to wonder, really, are you entering into a deal that may have no more legs than just 2 years? The three big strategic issues for Saudi Arabia are the following. Is American shale oil. So the single biggest threat to Saudi Arabia is the United States in that sense. So and again, yesterday there was reports that American shale oil is not slowing down as had been expected. So, and the Saudis understand the threat of shale oil because once it begins to occupy large parts of the market, it impacts fundamentally their most important strategic commodity, which is not just economic. Saudi Arabia's global power also rests on its importance to oil markets. The second big significant strategic issue for them is Iran, because it's been the rival in the region. As I said, Saudi Arabia sees that its main backer, the United States, has lost its interest in the region. They see Iranians, gaining in influence, and they're worried that the U.S. and Iran are talking. Even a subtle shift there has big impact for Saudi Arabia going forward. And the third issue is really ISIS and Islamic radicalism. The Saudi population, much like the Egyptian population, Jordanian population, is vulnerable to this. By some estimates, there are some 20,000 Saudis fighting in Syria. That's just the tip of the iceberg. There is sympathy for them. During the Arab Spring, Saudi Arabia had to commit itself to a much larger entitlement program in order to pacify the opposition. Syrian kids that need schooling in refugee camps is equivalent to the entire population of the state of Maryland. That's the size of and if you don't give them education, you're just basically growing a generation of displaced, alienated, uneducated youth with no hope